And welcome to our first real Western Civ history walking tour, the Battle of the Alamo. Any actual history tour of the Alamo battle should start here. We are in the main square of Bejar de San Antonio. Now, by the way, the original name of the town, San Antonio is the river. The original name would have been Bear, which is pronounced B-E-A-R, even though it's spelled B-E-X-A-R. It's an accent over the E. What we're standing in front of is the Catedral San Fernando, constructed in 1738. This would have been one of the few buildings in the area that would have been standing at the time that the contest for the Alamo began in December 1834. Would have been up almost 100 years. In and of itself, it's an excellent example of Spanish New World architecture and it's worth a visit. It's closed right now. It's breaking dawn here in San Antonio. Want to get to the Alamo at roughly the time the battle would have concluded. So you can't go inside right now, but you can under normal circumstances. Now, the rest of the square here is obviously all new construction. Now, there wouldn't have been a Starbucks here at the time in 1834, but it gives you a sense of the space. It would have been relatively tight. So why do we start here and not at the Alamo? Well, the answer is simple, because in December of 1834, it was the Mexican army that was actually in possession of Bear, not the Texans, the rebels, if they were so called by the Mexican forces. So what has to happen first is the Texan rebels have to take possession of Bear before Santa Anna comes and takes the town back and the Battle of the Alamo takes place. So what happens is in early November 1834, a group of Texan rebels under the command of Colonel William Travis moves to besiege Bear. Now, they're outnumbered about 2-1 at this point. That being said, throughout the entire contest, the Texans are going to have superior firearms and rifles, which is better than anything that the Mexican forces have. They have traditional muzzle loading firearms. Think of American Revolutionary War, something like that. Everything that the Texans have allows for better sharpshooting, better reloading, and a lot more distance and power. Now, what actually happens is on December 5th, a young man by the name of Ben Milam leads the assault on this area that we're standing in right now. In fact, sharpshooters were positioned on the top of the roof. Those would have been Mexican sharpshooters up there in the cathedral itself. The type of fighting that takes place between December 5th and December 13th is a kind of fighting that you're not going to see again until World War II. I'm talking street by street, house by house, garden by garden. Oftentimes, to try to gain an advantage, American soldiers will actually climb on top of the roofs of the houses and try to jump from one to the other. And then they burrow their way down in, fall through the ceiling into a group of Mexican soldados, and fight to the death. Interestingly, there's only 2 or 3 American deaths throughout the entirety of this stage of the combat. Now, the Mexican forces should have been able to hold on, but they weren't. And eventually Milam is able to overpower every city street, forcing the Mexican general, whose name is Perfecto de Cos, perfecto meaning perfect in Spanish. Santa Anna, his superior general, is going to find his performance in this battle something less than perfect when the two of them meet, but ends up pulling back to the Alamo and surrendering on December the 13th. And by December the 14th, he and his army is departing, and the rebels are now assuming control of the Alamo. So right now, as it stands in mid-December 1834, somewhat unexpectedly, the Texan rebels have taken possession of the town of Bejar de San Antonio. They control the church and all the surrounding territory that I'm looking at. Now, the town itself wouldn't have extended for more than a couple blocks. We're going to walk to the Alamo now, and the Alamo would have actually been outside of the actual town, which gives you a sense of just how small the town was, because it's only going to take us about 10 minutes to reach the Alamo. But almost immediately after taking possession of the town, William Travis And Ben Milam unfortunately is actually killed in the initial fighting on the 5th and 6th of December. So he's dead and gone, and this is going to be kind of a repeating situation. Decide to move the troops over to the Alamo because it's a more defensible structure, especially because most of the town that they just fought over was now in ruins. All right, we're going to move to the Alamo now. We're going to take the San Antonio Riverwalk, which obviously would not have been in existence at the time. And once we get down to the San Antonio Riverwalk, I'm going to back it up and we're going to talk about, okay, how did we get here in December 1834? Why are we fighting over this town? Why did the Texans want independence? Let's get down to the Riverwalk first. Riverwalk clearly wouldn't have existed at the time. Absolutely beautiful, and you get a sense of it today. It's actually set up for the parade later on. So as we get down here, our story, of course, goes all the way back to 1521, when Spain and the conquistadors, Cortez and all, first conquered Mexico. Between 1690 and roughly 1718, the Catholic Church makes a real concerted effort to try to expand its influence over what is today Texas. Spain never makes a real effort to control this region. They determine very quickly that it doesn't have the kind of resources that they're interested in, i.e. gold and especially silver. And as a result, they don't make a strong effort to try to exert any influence over the region today that we call northern Mexico and Texas. In 1819, Spain is going to cede what's called the neutral ground, which is a space between Louisiana currently and Texas to the United States, in exchange for United States recognition that they have no claim over Texas. This all comes about because, as you probably know, in the early 19th century, the United States, under Thomas Jefferson, purchases what's called the Louisiana Territory. Now, Thomas Jefferson is dead set that the Louisiana Territory includes Texas. And so there's this long back and forth that has ended in 1819 with the neutral ground secession that I just talked about. And again, crucially, the United States cedes any interest in Texas. That's not going to stop the Texans. Because only 2 years later, in 1821, Mexico wins its independence from Spain. Now, what that tells you is the battle that we're going to be talking about is in early 1835, the fight for the Alamo. So Mexico has only been a country for about 14 years since the time that has taken place, which gives you a sense of just how young this country was at the time that the battle takes place. Going back 1 year in 1820, a gentleman by the name of Moses Austin decides that he's going to start a series of colonies in what is today Texas, mostly East Texas, some of them focused not far from where I'm standing right now. Now, Moses Austin dies before he ever gets the opportunity to really put that plan into action. And so instead, what ends up happening is his son, a guy by the name of Stephen Austin, is the one who leads the efforts to colonize this part of Texas. Now, at different times, what you're going to see is individuals in the Mexican government have different theories about whether or not they support this. Sometimes the Mexican government is in favor of extra people coming in and colonizing a territory that they don't have a whole heck of a lot of interest in. Other times, individuals in the Mexican government are going to take a much more aggressive standpoint towards things that are happening in their territories. It just kind of goes back and forth. But it all comes to a head in 1830, because in 1830, the stance of the Mexican government changes rather dramatically vis-a-vis all of these different, I'll call them American Texan colonies that are taking place in what is today Texas. And the big change that happens is the liberal government of Mexico collapses. When the liberal government of the Mexicans collapses, it's replaced by a conservative government. And the conservative government is much less democratic. And we're heading up out of the Riverwalk now. up onto Houston Street, and that'll take us straight to the Alamo. So as I said, with the collapse of the liberal government, what you have is a new conservative government in place. And the conservative government is run by a gentleman by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Right here you can see. It's the gentleman who was killed in the initial assault, talked about just a second ago. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is one of those characters that if Hollywood doesn't eventually make a movie out of this guy, I give up. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is going to be the on-again, off-again dictator, president, whatever, lead general of Mexico all the way through the United States-Mexican War in the 1840s. He's an interesting fellow. He doesn't really like to govern, but he loves the flash of the battlefield. The Mexican army at the time, by the way, isn't particularly weak, per se. It's just that it doesn't have the best soldiers. Mexican army is very strong in cavalry. They have one of the strongest cavalries in the world. They have almost no artillery. And this is the age of Napoleon, when artillery is really everything, as we'll see when we get to the Alamo in the next couple of minutes here. So Santa Anna takes over it, and he immediately decides that he is going to punish a couple of different areas that have broken away from the Mexican government control. In fact, he goes immediately to a different province, slaughters the population, and makes an example out of them. And of course, as soon as this happens, the people in Texas begin to be concerned that this is what's going to happen to them. And as a result, they try to seize weapons and guns from their different towns. This then pushes the Mexican government to intervene, resulting in the battle for Bear, as we talked about. Now, the other factor that gets made a lot of here is the concept of slavery. A lot of books that you'll read today talk about how important slavery was for the Texans who were settled in the region of Texas. And certainly, if you look at the population of Texas at the time, about 1 out of every 5, 1 out of every 6 individuals was an enslaved African. So there was a lot of slavery here, even though technically under the Mexican Constitution, slavery was supposed to be illegal. Now, that being said, it's pretty clear by reading some of the old constitutions and documents that slavery was a minor concern of a lot of the colonists. They were going to go on doing it regardless, so it didn't really factor in. Much more concern from them were the high taxes that Santa Anna wanted to put in place and the controls. These people had migrated to Texas because they wanted individual liberties, and above all, they wanted land. And now it seemed like Santa Anna was going to take those away. On top of that, even though slavery was illegal in Mexico, they had a very stringent system of debt peonage. Under the debt peonage Mexican system, you could find yourself essentially enslaved. You could still be sold and traded. You were still the property of a person who, quote-unquote, owned you. It was much more akin to serfdom than any sort of a peonage. Alright, so that takes us up to the battle itself. So by January 6th, word reaches the rebels who are located here in San Antonio that there's a large Mexican army that's on its way. Santa Anna, in fact, is on his way north. He's got about 4,000 troops under him. They're not all going to get there, and they're not all crack troops. He's probably got about 800 really solid infantrymen. He's got a couple hundred excellent cavalrymen, but he only has a few cannon. And they're relatively small, maybe 8-pounders, 10-pound guns, things that could do a lot of damage to the Alamo's walls if they got them close enough. On the other hand, the rebels have a lot of cannon. They have at least 4 or 5 pieces of artillery that are going to be stationed on the 4 walls, as I'll show you in just a second here once we reach the structure. It's just up the road. That cannon could be the great equalizer. Because what it's going to come down to is it's going to be about 3,500 men, Mexicans, versus about 200 rebels in the Alamo. So it's enormous odds. Now, the rebels are holding out at this point because there's another rebel force. It's only about a 3-day march away from here, 400 men strong with another 2 artillery pieces. They assume that that force is going to come to their rescue. It isn't going to, right? And not too far away in Washington, that's a small town in Texas, not the big U.S. capital, Sam Houston is organizing further resistance, and they expect at any day to hear that Sam Houston is marching and is on his way. Also, not going to happen. But that's their expectation as they're going through here. Now, on January the 19th, so after word has already reached the people in the Alamo, which is under command at this point of a gentleman by the name of William Travis. Come back to him in a second. On the 19th of January, a small group of reinforcements, 19 men, 20 men or so, reached the Alamo. And in that group is one of our colorful characters, Jim Bowie. Jim Bowie of the famous Bowie knife doesn't unfortunately take part in the Battle of the Alamo. It's one of those disappointing parts of history that you just kind of have to deal with. Jim Bowie is actually sick in bed at the time of the battle. According to legend, he lays in bed with 2 small guns and kills several Mexicans when they try to come and kill him. I'm not sure if that happened. Regardless, Jim Bowie is killed in his bed on the day of the attack and doesn't take part in the battle. But his legend casts a long shadow and is something that we should be aware of as we're going forward. All right, so now we have reached the Alamo. As I said, it only took us about 10 minutes to walk here. Santa Anna and his army would have reached here on the 23rd and 24th of February, 1835. They would have surrounded, and I put surround in air quotes at this point, because the line was fairly porous and it was easy to move people back and forth between it. They dug a series of trenches, would have been a little bit further out from where we're standing right now. You can see the main wall right over there. Now, as I said, they don't have any artillery pieces. The artillery is all with the rebels inside of the Alamo. All he has are infantry. So he surrounds it and settles down to what's going to be a traditional siege. You wait and see if you can starve them out. They've got about enough food for a month inside the Alamo itself. And in addition to the 200 soldiers, you have several hundred women and children as well. So you have a lot of people that you have to feed. It's a relatively small space, as we'll see when we're walking around it here, because what ends up happening is the usual effects of a siege. You've got sickness, you've got dysentery, you've got all the things that happen when you don't have a lot of clean water, right? Here's the front of the Alamo. This part isn't going to be attacked. By and large, we're going to be focusing on the walls that are extending over here to the left. So by the 23rd and the 24th, they've completely surrounded the Alamo, entrapping the defenders within. At this point, we have our other colorful character who has joined us, Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett is kind of a late arrival, him and his Tennessee volunteers. Davy Crockett arrives in Texas as a result of a series of failed election attempts. Davy Crockett is tied very closely to Andrew Jackson, but the two gentlemen have a falling out over his successor and wound up never being able to reconcile their differences. This leads to a series of unsuccessful business ventures by Crockett. He takes a fun tour of the East. He's probably the most famous cultural icon in United States history at the time that this happens. A lot more famous than Jim Bowie, who's just kind of more of a regional legend. But Davy Crockett is absolutely world known, if not known across the United States. He arrives, he's a crack shot. Him and his Tennesseans are going to be posted probably right over here. So if we take a look here, we're at the east. Eastern corner is over there. West is over here. So we would have expected them to be right up on this corner, right here. Now what you're going to tell immediately from this, the wall's fairly high. The wall over here is about 10 feet, made of stone and adobe. It's solid, it's about 3 feet thick. You'd have to get a cannon right up on it to do some major damage, and Santa Anna doesn't have any cannon anyway, so he's not going to be able to do anything with that. But this is not designed as a fortress. What you would see if this was a fortress is it would have parapet settings, so you'd have that traditional, you know, up-down that you see on a castle wall. Because you don't have that, defenders are going to have two choices. You can either sit back behind the walls and let the Mexican troops put the ladders up and come over, or you can reach up over the top and fire down. But if you reach up over the top and fire down, then you're going to be presenting a perfect shot for all the hundreds of soldiers who are standing to the back. And in fact, in the very throes of the first battle, Colonel Travis, who I talked about a second ago, he fires the first Texan shot down. He actually reaches over the wall, cocks his shotgun, fires down, bam, takes a bullet in the head, and he's dead instantly. So the commander of the Alamo falls probably within the first minutes of the assault taking place. So let's talk about that. I'm going to come around to the northern side here, because that's where the bulk of the fighting would have taken place. The northern side of the wall is the weak side of the wall. This part is made of stone and adobe, but the northern side of the wall is constructed mostly of limestone, and it's a little bit smaller. And if you have any experience with limestone, what you're going to know is limestone's really porous. You could take it down with a hammer. You don't need a cannon to take down a limestone wall. Now, on the 5th of March, Santa Anna has had enough of the siege. He informs all of his commanders that the battle will take place the next morning. They actually attack pre-dawn, so it's morning here at this point. It's a little after 7 a.m. The battle would have been over at this point, because the battle ends relatively quickly. It's only about an hour. I hate to disappoint everybody. So the attack is going to take place at dawn the next day. The Mexicans are able to sneak up at about 4:30 in the morning on the sentries, who are positioned probably right about here, kind of gauging my steps. It's about 100 feet out. They're supposed to warn the people inside the Alamo if there's an attack. Unfortunately, the Mexicans are able to sneak up on them, slit their throats, and get the jump on them at that point. So when the bugle call goes at about 5 in the morning on the 6th of March, 1835, the defenders in the Alamo have almost no warning as to what's happening. Travis is woken as the Mexicans are already approaching the walls, and that's problematic, because if we hop up here, you'll see there's not places to put cannons so that you can fire them down. You can tilt them, but the best shot is going to be to fire them out. And if they're already up against the wall, then you can't hit them. Now, don't get me wrong, the rebels get off a bunch of good cannon shots here and kill hundreds of Mexican soldiers as they're coming up, mostly using buckshot. So you're going to be stuffing metal, all kinds of different pieces into the cannon and then firing it like a giant shotgun into the people that are coming up against you. But once the Mexican soldiers get up against those walls, there's very, very little that the rebels are going to be able to do to dissuade them. So let's go over here where the bulk of the attack was focused. Santa Anna was no fool, and it's actually under construction right now. He knew that this place had one weak point, and you can see it right now. So right over here, look at the difference in the height. I can reach up and touch it. You don't even need a ladder to get up over that. So this is about 10 feet. This one's only about 6 feet tall. This is weak. This is all weak stone. It would have been even weaker over here. You can see the color difference changed pretty dramatically. So here's where the breach happens. Right over here is where the breach of the wall takes place. And the Mexicans are able to pour in. It's the obvious weak point. This is also where Travis posts the majority of his troops, but he's killed almost immediately. Once the Mexican soldiers are in the war, or are within the walls, the battle's over within about 45 minutes. We don't exactly know how Davy Crockett dies. He's got a couple of bullets in him, a couple of bayonet slashes in him. He's killed. We know that Bowie is killed in his bed. Everybody else is killed in the fighting, except for two. One guy gets away, and then there's one slave who is able to convince the Mexicans that he didn't take any part in the fighting. Otherwise, Santa Anna's already raised the black flag, which means that there aren't going to be any prisoners taken. So every single person is killed. The women and the children are allowed to escape. Santa Anna actually tries to seduce one of the women, but is unsuccessful in doing so. That's kind of a thing he's got during the siege. He found a liking for a young woman in the city. She didn't want to be with him unless he married her, so one of his officers found a disguise to dress up like a pretend Catholic priest. They got married, and then they consummated the marriage, even though Santa Anna was already married. So why does this matter? Well, everybody dies. At least all the fighting men die. But the reality is, if they give up, then that is going to cost a significant amount of time, because the Battle of San Jacinto is the big battle between Sam Houston's forces and Santa Anna. And that takes place on April the 21st, 1835. And Santa Anna is essentially chasing them all the way north to the Colorado River. He has to hold up here for about 2 weeks, and if he doesn't have to hold up here for about 2 weeks to stop at the Alamo, that doesn't give Houston enough time to get the forces together. Because at the Battle of San Jacinto, not only is the Mexican army completely defeated, but Santa Anna himself is taken captive. And as a result, they're able to use his captivity to force the Mexican soldiers to withdraw from Texas, and there's a grant of independence that follows fairly quickly thereafter. So the men who sacrificed their lives at the Alamo didn't sell them for nothing. They sold them to give the fledgling Texican government time to hammer out a constitution, which is going to result in United States recognition fairly shortly thereafter, although it doesn't become a state for a bit. And they give Sam Houston and his army time to gather the men together and to win the Battle of San Jacinto, which is going to result in the actual final recognition of independence from the Mexican government, kind of begrudgingly, because Santa Anna is trapped with them at the time. So there you have it. That's the Alamo. It's not huge, but a very important part of United States history. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short walking tour. If you're interested in more, check out the website, westernsydpodcast.com. Follow the channel for more history walking tours. And in the future, hopefully, we'll get whole city tours. Until next time, the Alamo.